I knew I was an outsider the moment my sister's husband called me her weird cousin in front of his perfect family. But I didn't expect one dinner to unravel every lie that held their world together. All my life, I'd watched from the sidelines as my sister built her new life, marrying into money, rewriting her story, letting people like me become background noise. But when his father heard my last name, the entire table went silent. That's when I realized sometimes the past refuses to stay buried, no matter how hard you pretend. If you learned your family's fortune was built on betraying your own, would you expose the truth or keep the peace? I watched city lights flicker on the car window as Milwaukee faded behind me. Suitcase wedged by my knee. Camera bag clutched in my lap. The driver's eyes met mine in the mirror. "Big night?" he asked, gentle. I almost said yes. Instead, I said just family. He nodded. But the way my hands trembled, I knew it wasn't just anything. Growing up, Allison and I shared everything. We were the Matthews girls. She fixed problems. I captured them. She made plans. I broke the rules. We thought nothing could break us, not dad losing his business, not mom's night shifts, not that first year in a tiny apartment with paper-thin walls. But time has a way of splitting sisters. She took the elevator up. I stayed ground level looking up at her window, trying not to feel left behind. Her wedding invitation felt like a formality, not a welcome. But I went. I watched her become a Wilson. I watched myself fade from her story frame by frame. Tonight, she needed me at her father-in-law's birthday. She texted, "Please come, dress however you want. It'll mean a lot." I could hear the strain under her words. I packed my favorite jacket. The one that still smelled faintly of darkroom chemicals and cold coffee. I needed armor. The Wilson house was a mansion-polished stone sweeping drive doormen in suits. Every surface gleamed. It smelled like lemons and something expensive I couldn't name. I saw my reflection in the front glass. Tired eyes. Old scars. But I pressed the bell. A housekeeper opened the door before I could knock. She greeted me like I was on a guest list, not family. I handed her my coat. Heard voices in the next room, glasses clinking, laughter too bright, the thump of jazz. "Allison's sister is here," someone called. Heads turned. I felt every stare. Bradley, her husband, raised his glass eyes, sliding over me. "Hannah. Glad you made it," he said, grinning. "Everyone, this is Allison's cousin. She does art." Laughter. Polite smiles. No one corrected him. Not even Allison. Evelyn, his mother, kissed the air beside my cheek. "So creative," she said, lingering on the word. I touched my hair, tried to stand straighter. Allison came, squeezed my hand. She whispered, "Ignore them. Please." Her smile flickered, old and tired. Questions followed me through the room. "Still doing photography? Milwaukee. Is it safe? Do you sell your art or?" Each one chipped away at me. I answered anyway. I didn't want Allison to see how much it hurt. I watched Bradley work the room, perfect teeth, perfect suit, always half a step ahead of Allison. I saw how she shrank beside him. How her laugh changed. How her eyes never quite met mine. Dinner was announced. Everyone flowed toward the table, finding seats like they'd rehearsed this 1,000 times. Mine was at the far end. Out of the way. I sat down, hands folded tight. A silver fork. A name card, Hannah Matthews, in the wrong script, slightly smudged. My phone buzzed. A text from Mom. "Don't let anyone hurt you tonight, okay?" I pressed my palm flat on the table, grounding myself. The smell of roasted meat. Candle wax. A faint hint of old cigar smoke. Bradley stood to make introductions. One by one he listed jobs, titles, schools, spouses. When he reached me, he barely paused. "My wife's cousin. She's an artist. Does photography. Milwaukee, right?" I smiled. Nodded. I swallowed my name. The conversation swirled around stocks, vacations, private schools. Now and then someone lobbed a question my way about crime, about city life, about my little shows. Allison barely looked up. I wondered if she'd even noticed how far apart we'd become. The meal blurred by. I felt the cold from the window behind me. I watched ice melt in my glass. I counted the chandelier bulbs. I counted the ways I could have walked away. But I stayed. For Allison. Then, halfway through dessert, Richard Wilson, her father-in-law, turned to me. His eyes sharp. "What was your last name again?" he asked. I answered, voice steady, "Matthews." He went dead silent. Coffee cup suspended halfway to his lips. All conversation stopped. A chill cut through the room. He stared at me like he'd seen a ghost. Some truths only need a single word to shatter everything you thought was real. Would you keep sitting at the table, or would you finally speak? People say money can't buy happiness. But it sure buys a kind of armor, one that glitters, blinds, and pushes you to the edges if you don't know the code. That's how it felt stepping into the Wilsons' world. A space designed to impress, but also to remind you exactly where you stood. The foyer was twice the size of my apartment. Marble floors. A chandelier that looked like it belonged in a museum, not a house. Each surface caught the light in a way that felt intentional, sharp, almost surgical. My shoes sounded too loud as I crossed to the living room. 1,000 tiny judgments in every glance. The Wilsons didn't greet so much as inspect. Evelyn, the matriarch, waved her champagne flute. "Isn't she charming?" she told a friend. Allison's sister, the artist. "Milwaukee is so bohemian these days." I smiled. The kind that says I've heard it all before. But inside, I cataloged every word, every raised brow. Bradley's brother James made small talk about his latest golf trip. Elizabeth, his sister, complimented my earrings, then asked if I'd driven all the way from the city. The unspoken translation, "You don't belong here." Allison tried to pull me aside but was quickly swept up by a cousin. I caught her eye across the room, her look pleaded for patience. She mouthed sorry. Bradley came over grinning. "Heard you had a new show open," he asked, voice just a shade too loud. "Where was it?" "Someplace local, Chicago," I replied even. His eyebrow lifted, impressed for half a second. But then, "Well, everyone needs a hobby. You should meet my friend Rob, he's really into photography. For Instagram." A few people chuckled. I kept my smile in place. If there's one thing I'd learned, it's how to take a hit and keep standing. I stood near the mantel surveying the party. Everywhere wealth on display. Artwork that didn't move me. Furniture arranged like a showroom. Laughter that seemed rehearsed. For a moment I missed home. The crooked floorboards. The cluttered warmth of my kitchen. The way my apartment smelled of coffee and fixer. I reminded myself I was here for Allison. Not for them. But as I watched her disappear deeper into the crowd, her laugh too high and bright, I wondered if she remembered the sound of her own voice. Or if she was becoming someone new, someone I barely recognized. Dinner was called, and just like that, every conversation paused. People migrated toward the dining room as if pulled by invisible strings. The walls gleamed with soft gold light reflecting off portraits of ancestors I'd never meet, their painted eyes cold and certain. I trailed behind, wondering where I'd be placed in their carefully orchestrated world. The table stretched forever, a shimmering display of silverware, crystal, and pressed white linen. Name cards in perfect script marked everyone's spot. Mine waited at the far end, isolated but close enough to witness the family's performance. As I took my seat, the room filled with the sound of chairs scraping and polite laughter. I felt the weight of my own body, the way my dress bunched at the knees, my heart thumping a little too fast. Bradley sat near the head, Allison beside him, already tucked into her role as a perfect wife. Allison glanced my way. Her smile was tight, eyes darting to Bradley, then back to me. A silent message passed between us. "Please. Just try." The air buzzed with low conversations, business deals, school acceptances, a new lake house. I answered a question about the Milwaukee art scene, felt eyes glaze over the topic, dropped like an ice cube down the drain. Bradley's uncle asked what brought me to Chicago. "Family," I answered. He nodded, then shifted toward someone more important. I watched the forks rise and fall, hands gesturing above the tablecloth, wedding bands glinting in the light. Every gesture seemed loaded with some code I didn't understand. The servers brought the first course. I unfolded my napkin, noticing my hands were shaking just a little. Beside me, Elizabeth leaned in. "Do you travel much for your work, or is it mostly local?" Her tone was polite, curious, but I heard the undertone. "Local. Small." I answered evenly. "A bit of both. I had a show in New York last year." She blinked, surprised. "Oh. Well, that's impressive." I gave a small smile, grateful for the tiny accidental crack in the wall. But it closed as quickly as it had opened, swallowed by the next wave of conversation about summer plans in the south of France. I pressed my palm against the underside of the table, grounding myself, listening to the clink of silverware and the hum of air conditioning. For a moment, I imagined standing up, announcing who I really was, what I'd survived to be here. But I stayed silent, watching the show, playing my part. I tried to eat, but each bite tasted like dust. Every time I looked up, I caught someone's eyes sliding away, polite but distant. It was like being a guest at a performance where you'd never learned your lines. Bradley was in his element, telling a story about his latest deal, the room laughing at all the right moments. He kept one arm draped behind Allison's chair, a signal and a claim. Someone asked if I'd ever considered settling down or using my art for something practical. I smiled, told them I'd found purpose in the stories I captured. Someone else laughed. "Purpose is nice. Security is better." The table rippled with gentle amusement. Allison didn't join in. She picked at her food, shoulders tight, her gaze fixed on her wineglass. I knew that look. It was the face she wore when she was barely holding it together, something she'd perfected since marrying Bradley. Dessert arrived, a glossy cake, more sculpture than food. Conversation rose and fell in practiced waves. I listened to them talk about private schools, endowments, real estate. No one asked about the world I knew, the city's forgotten alleys, the old men I photographed at dawn, the ways I'd pieced a living together from grit and hope. I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't here to be seen. I was here for Allison. But as I watched her grow smaller, her laugh becoming someone else's, I felt my resolve crack. The space between us had never felt so wide. Then Bradley leaned over and said just loud enough, "You ever think about a real job, Hannah? Something with benefits?" The words cut deeper than I let show. I straightened my shoulders. Art is work. And not everyone needs a desk to make a living. Bradley's mouth twisted. He shrugged, turning back to his father, ending the moment with a dismissive flick. Silence pressed in around me. A beat later, someone filled it, changing the subject to next season's ski trip. I swallowed hard, willing myself not to vanish. Under the table, my fists curled tight in my lap, nails pressing half moons into my skin. Time stretched and the party's polish began to fade. The further the night wore on, the more I saw through the cracks, tiny moments that didn't fit the script. Allison's laugh came late, now brittle at the edges. Her napkin twisted and untwisted in her hands, knuckles white. She spoke less, nodding along to conversations she once would have led. Every now and then her gaze found mine, something silent and pleading in her eyes. At one point, Evelyn caught me alone at the sideboard. She smiled, that thin, careful smile, the kind that never reached her eyes. "It's lovely to have you here, dear. Family is everything, isn't it?" Her hand brushed my shoulder, cold and quick. "I'm so glad Allison still stays in touch with her roots." Roots, as if I was something to be grown out of. I murmured my thanks, feeling the chill linger long after she moved on. A lull settled over the table after coffee. Someone suggested a toast to Richard the Patriarch for another successful year. Crystal glasses rose, light scattering across the faces of a family that, for all its perfection, suddenly looked so fragile to me. Richard himself entered then, late from a phone call, his presence magnetic. People shifted, angling toward him, eager for his attention. Allison's entire posture changed. She sat straighter, her face arranged into careful approval. Bradley beamed, launching into another round of introductions. I braced myself, already knowing my part in this ritual. He paused when he reached me, his voice just a little louder. "And that's Allison's cousin, the artist. She keeps life interesting." A couple of the younger cousins laughed, and I felt my cheeks flush. No one corrected him. Not even Allison. The crack inside me widened. I pressed my lips together, pretending not to notice the sting. Pretending not to see the way Allison's eyes filled with regret. The sound of forks and glasses faded, replaced by the rush of blood in my ears. That's when I saw Richard watching me, really watching, like he was trying to place a face from an old memory. For a moment, I wondered if he saw more than the outsider at the table. If maybe finally someone was going to see the truth. The dinner moved forward, but everything inside me felt suspended, like I was holding my breath and couldn't let go. There was a new tension in the air, a sense that something unspoken was about to break the surface. Richard's gaze kept drifting my way. Each time he seemed more unsettled, distracted from the conversations swirling around him. Finally, as dessert plates were cleared and coffee was poured, he leaned forward, peering down the long table. "What was your last name again?" His question cut through the noise, and for a moment every conversation stopped. I looked up, heart thudding. "Matthews," I said, letting the name hang in the room. He froze, coffee cup halfway to his lips. The pause stretched too long. People looked up, curious, suddenly aware of a new current running under the surface. "From Milwaukee?" he asked, his voice uneven. I nodded, confusion rising. "Yes. Jonathan Matthews is my father." Silence spread like a shadow. Allison went pale. Bradley's eyes narrowed, sensing a shift he couldn't control. Richard set his cup down, hands trembling. He stared at me as if seeing a ghost, the mask of the polished patriarch slipping just enough for everyone to glimpse the fear underneath. Evelyn reached for his arm. "Richard, are you all right?" He didn't answer. His gaze stayed locked on mine, a flicker of something raw and unguarded in his expression. In that moment, I felt the entire room pivot. Every false comfort, every carefully built illusion suddenly fragile. For years I'd felt invisible at this table. Tonight, with one word, Matthews, I had become impossible to ignore. As the tension deepened, I realized the story was shifting. The cracks in the gilded walls were no longer hidden. Something was about to break wide open. Would I finally be brave enough to face whatever waited behind those eyes? Sometimes the place you're given at a table says everything about who you are. Tonight, mine was as far from the head as you could get. I slid into the chair, the stiff linen napkin folded just so the chill from the window sneaking under the tablecloth to my knees. Silverware glinted under the chandelier, perfectly aligned, like a warning. People settled in with the confidence of those who've never worried if they belonged. I looked down at my name card. Hannah Matthews. My handwriting, my name, but written in someone else's script. My heart thudded, dull and heavy. Bradley surveyed the room, pleased, a king presiding over his domain. Allison sat at his right, smiling, careful, poised. She caught my eye and offered a small apologetic wave. I tried to smile back, but my throat felt too tight. Richard Wilson took his seat at the head. Evelyn at his side, pearls catching the light. Bradley's siblings and their spouses fanned out, lawyers, investment managers, old money and new. Someone poured wine. The scent was sharp, astringent, making my tongue prickle. Chatter began light and easy, all the topics safe and clean. I felt the insulation, the practiced civility, the way discomfort was smoothed away like wrinkles in the tablecloth. My mind drifted to childhood dinners, elbows on the table, laughter over mac and cheese, Dad making puns so bad we groaned, Allison and me fighting over the last biscuit. Back when being seen meant being loved. Here I was a placeholder. A name on a list. The artist cousin. The one who didn't quite fit. Allison's laughter reached me, too loud, too polished. A servant refilled my glass, silent, efficient. I straightened my spine, determined not to shrink. If this was the role I'd been cast in, I'd play it, but I wouldn't vanish. Not tonight. Dinner began with a practiced clinking of glasses and the ritual toasts that marked every Wilson family occasion. Evelyn raised her flute, her voice crisp and bright, praising Richard's accomplishments and the family's good fortune. Applause rippled down the table. Smiles followed like choreography, polite, precise, automatic. I lifted my glass, the stem slippery in my fingers. The wine tasted expensive but left my mouth dry. Course after course arrived, each plate a work of art. Forks moved in unison, silver catching the light. Conversation ebbed and flowed: vacations in Provence, new board appointments, summer homes, and private schools. The Wilsons spoke in their own language, every word edged with accomplishment. Now and then a question was lobbed my way, as if fulfilling an obligation. "So, Hannah, what's your next project?" "Still working in the arts," I nodded, answering simply. "I have a show opening next month." "That's interesting," said Bradley's aunt, pausing just long enough on the word to draw a line between her world and mine. Someone else chimed in. "There's always room for creativity if you have something to fall back on." A ripple of laughter followed. Allison barely touched her food. Her eyes flicked between Bradley and me as if trying to measure the distance. I caught her gaze, tried to offer reassurance, but she looked away. Her shoulders curled in small and tense. Bradley dominated the conversation, recounting a story about a business deal, his tone loud and jovial. His hand stayed fixed to Allison's shoulder, grounding her or maybe keeping her in place. I watched silent as he recast our family history in a sentence or two. "Allison was always the achiever," he said. "Her sister. The free spirit. She's still in Milwaukee, you know. Keeps things interesting." The table responded with knowing smiles. I shrank inward but kept my expression neutral. It's strange how you can be surrounded by people and still feel like you're the ghost at your own family's table. I sipped my wine and let the next course arrive, determined not to let anyone see me flinch. The meal went on, each course more elaborate than the last. Conversations grew louder, laughter swelling in the high-ceilinged room. I watched as stories and achievements passed around the table like hors d'oeuvres, everyone eager to shine. Bradley told another story, something about sealing a deal that changed the game. His voice filled the room, his confidence contagious. People leaned in. Even Richard looked pleased, nodding along. I tried to disappear into my chair, tracing the pattern on my napkin, letting the noise wash over me. But it wasn't just noise. It was an undercurrent, a performance, with every person fighting for their place in the spotlight. At one point, Elizabeth turned to me, eyes bright. "Hannah, did you ever think about moving to Chicago? There's a market for creative types. Maybe Allison can help you network." The word help lingered, soft but barbed. I managed a small smile. "Thanks, but I like Milwaukee." She nodded, her smile fixed as if she'd expected a different answer. The table moved on, leaving me behind. I glanced at Allison. She looked trapped, half listening, half wishing to escape. It was in those moments I saw at most the subtle reshaping of her. The way she checked Bradley's reaction before she spoke. The way she mimicked Evelyn's posture, the way she hid her hands in her lap. I remembered how as kids we used to play at grown-ups, draping ourselves in mom's scarves, inventing new names, laughing at how fake it all felt. Now it was real. And Allison was disappearing behind the mask she'd spent years building. Dessert was announced with a flourish, candles, applause, the room rising in a chorus of celebration. For a moment the focus shifted. Richard stood to make a short speech thanking everyone for being there, his voice heavy with pride and age. As he sat, his eyes drifted back to me. Something flickered in his gaze, a question maybe, or a memory trying to resurface. The applause faded, but the tension only grew. I felt it in my skin, a pressure building, waiting for something, anything to finally snap. Candlelight shimmered across the cake as Richard's birthday song ended, and for a moment the room was golden and unbroken. Everyone's smiling glasses raised, the illusion almost complete. Richard made a simple wish, blowing out the candles with practiced gravitas. Plates clattered. Someone cheered for another toast. Evelyn leaned over, her hand light on Richard's arm. "Another year, another triumph," she said, her voice rich with pride and possession. Richard nodded, but his eyes were elsewhere, lingering on me. Bradley's turn came for a toast. He stood smiling wide, his arms still looped behind Allison's chair. "To my wife, to my father, to a family built on hard work and trust." His gaze swept the table, resting on me just long enough to draw a line. "And to the friends and extended family who keep things interesting." A few people chuckled. Someone muttered, "Hear, hear," and the mood rolled on. Allison's face was unreadable, her hand frozen on her wine glass. I wanted to reach out, but the gulf felt too wide. Bradley sat. Silence pressed in for half a beat, heavy and expectant. Then Elizabeth piped up. "Hannah, do you have a toast? You must have something creative to share." Every head turned. Suddenly all eyes were on me. My mouth went dry. I rose slowly, glass in hand, feeling the heat creep up my neck. "For Richard," I said, voice clear but quiet, "for the family that welcomed me tonight, for Allison, who's taught me more about strength than anyone I know. And for those of us still finding our place even when the map isn't clear." A pause. I looked at Allison, her eyes shining, caught between hope and something else. "To truth," I finished. "May it always find the light." My glass trembled as I sat. For a moment the room was still. Then Bradley laughed a little too loud. "Hear that? Always, the philosopher." Laughter returned, the tension sliding just beneath the surface. But I saw Richard's hands clench just once around his cup. Something had shifted, a fault line opening under the table, invisible but unstoppable. The conversation tried to recover, but the rhythm had changed. The sound of laughter felt forced, sharp at the edges. Richard's focus stayed fixed on me. I could sense the question building behind his eyes, growing heavier with each passing minute. A lull settled after dessert, the kind that happens when everyone feels the room cooling but can't say why. Bradley tapped at his phone. Allison traced circles on her plate. Evelyn recounted some story from Paris, but her voice barely pierced the hush. Then Richard cleared his throat. The simple sound was enough to command the room. He set down his coffee, gaze unwavering. "Hannah," he said, each syllable careful, "I'm sorry to ask again, but your last name." Every conversation stopped. My chest tightened. "Matthews," I answered, the word steady on my tongue. He nodded, once eyes narrowing. "And your father's name?" "Jonathan Matthews," I said quietly. A tremor passed through him. His hand shook against his cup. Silence unfurled across the table, thick and absolute. Bradley frowned, shifting in his chair. "Dad, is something wrong?" But Richard was lost in another world. He looked at me, really looked, as if searching for answers in the lines of my face. Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin, uncertain line. I felt the heat of every gaze. The mask of civility in the room slipping layer by careful layer. Richard pushed back his chair. It scraped loud and jarring across the tile. He rose to his full height, shoulders suddenly weighted by something old and immense. "Excuse me," he said, voice rough. He left the table, disappearing down the hall. The silence he left behind was deeper than any before. I could feel the aftershocks rippling around the table. Eyes flicked to me, to Allison, to Bradley, then away again. No one knew what to say. I sat frozen, heart hammering, the taste of truth sharp in my mouth. I had come tonight expecting nothing but survival. But something had broken. And whatever had been hiding beneath this family's polished surface was about to erupt. Would I run from the fracture or stand my ground in the fallout? The hush after Richard left was the deepest I'd ever felt. Not just a lack of sound, an absence of vacuum that pulled at every word unsaid in the room. No one moved. I stared at the spot where Richard had been, his chair pushed back, the cup still trembling on its saucer. Allison sat frozen, knuckles white around her napkin. Bradley's jaw worked, his fingers drumming the table, a nervous rhythm cutting through the quiet. Evelyn recovered first, straightening her pearls. "Well," she said, forcing a thin smile, "shall we move to the drawing room for coffee?" The others shuffled to their feet, chairs scraping tile. Conversation restarted in a rush, too loud, too eager, everyone pretending nothing had happened. I moved on autopilot, following the herd into another immaculate room. Oil paintings, a marble hearth, the scent of wax, and old books. But no one looked at me. I was the storm cloud on a summer afternoon, something to be skirted around, not faced head-on. Allison found me by the window, her voice barely a whisper. "What was that? Do you know why he acted that way?" I shook my head, though a suspicion curled in my stomach. Bradley appeared, voice sharp. "Did you say something to upset him?" I stared at him. "He asked about my name. That's all." He huffed, hands on hips, clearly frustrated by anything not in his control. This was supposed to be a celebration. I almost said, Maybe your family should try honesty for a change. But I bit my tongue. Evelyn hovered nearby fielding questions from aunts and cousins, her smile stretched thin. You know how Richard gets. Sometimes the past, it catches up. Her words hung there uneasy. I pressed my palm to the cold glass, watching my own reflection shiver in the late-night light. Something old was waking up in this house. And I was the match. It didn't take long for Bradley to corner me in the corridor. He shut the door behind him, cutting off the gentle background music and the drone of nervous conversation from the drawing room. For a moment, we stood in a silence so tense I could hear my own pulse in my ears. What did you say to my father? He demanded, his voice pitched low. I kept my hands steady at my sides. He asked my name. I told him. That's all. Bradley's eyes searched my face, looking for some angle, some accusation he could use. Why would that upset him? Are you sure you didn't? I cut him off, tired of being interrogated. You heard what I said, Bradley. Ask your father if you want the truth. He scoffed, the sound tight, ugly. This is not the time for drama, Hannah. It's his birthday. The last thing we need is— He stopped, catching himself, trying to regain composure. He took a step back, running a hand through his hair. Just stay here. I'll go see what's going on. He stalked off down the hallway, leaving me standing among portraits of Wilson ancestors' faces painted in oil, forever confident, forever belonging. Their eyes followed me as I paced their gold frames, catching the lamplight. Footsteps approached, softer, lighter. Allison. She reached for me, her voice trembling. Are you okay? I nodded, but I could see the fear behind her eyes. Not just for me, for her, for what this crack in their perfect world might reveal. Allison. I whispered. Did Dad ever talk to you about the Wilsons? Did you know anything? She shook her head wide-eyed. Never. He barely talked about the past at all. Just said, some people don't keep their promises. Her words pressed a bruise inside me, old and deep. We stood together in the long hallway, two daughters from another story, waiting for a door to open, or maybe for the past itself to step out and name its price. A muffled voice came from the far end. The heavy wooden door to Richard's study clicked open. Bradley's silhouette lingered in the doorway, stiff with tension. He wants to speak to you, he said, avoiding my gaze. Allison squeezed my hand. I'm not leaving you alone, she said, her voice small but firm. But Bradley shook his head. Dad said, just Hannah. Alone. My mouth went dry. My feet felt anchored to the floor. This was at the threshold. All those years of being pushed to the margins suddenly pulled into the center. The door stood open, dark and waiting. Inside, the past waited too. I stepped into Richard's study, the door closing softly behind me. The room was heavy with the smell of leather and old paper, a world apart from the polished brightness outside. Dark shelves lined the walls, packed with books and framed certificates. A single desk lamp cast long shadows across the carpet. Richard stood by the window, his back to me, shoulders hunched. For the first time, he didn't look like the man who ruled the dinner table. He looked tired. Smaller. Human. He turned, eyes shadowed, and gestured to a chair. Please, Hannah. Sit. I crossed the room, heart thumping, and lowered myself into the stiff leather seat. Richard stayed by the window for a moment, one hand gripping the sill, the other clutching a drink he barely seemed to notice. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. Matthews, he said, the word slow and deliberate. I haven't heard that name in a long time. I watched him carefully. You knew my father. He nodded. Jonathan and I were business partners. A lifetime ago. His voice thickened like something caught in his throat. He came to the desk and opened a drawer, pulling out a photograph. He handed it to me with shaking fingers. I stared down at two young men, arms around each other, grinning. My father. Richard, almost unrecognizable, smiling, open before time and regret closed him up. We started a firm together, he said quietly. We dreamed big, took risks. For a while it worked, until it didn't. He looked away, voice breaking. We had a falling out. I made decisions I regret, bad ones. Things happened that I never made right. 1,000 questions fought to be heard in my chest. I gripped the photo, knuckles white. Was it your fault? My father lost everything. Richard closed his eyes. Yes. I betrayed him. I built this family's fortune on a lie. On his ruin. The words hit me like cold water, flooding every old hurt I thought I'd buried. All those years of silence in my house, the way Dad changed the truth, had a shape now. And it wore Richard Wilson's face. He sank into the chair behind the desk, shoulders collapsing. I'm sorry, Hannah. I should have told the truth a long time ago. The quiet that followed wasn't peace. It was the sound of something old and broken stirring awake. For a moment, I just sat there gripping the photograph, the weight of Richard's confession pressing into my chest. Everything I'd guessed, every uneasy feeling from my childhood found its name in that single word: betrayal. I heard my own voice before I felt it, quiet but sharper than I intended. You destroyed him. My father, my family. Richard looked up, his eyes shining with old pain. I know I did. And I have lived with that guilt every day since. You can't imagine. No, I cut him off, breathing hard. I can. I lived it too. You may have gone on with your life, but we lost everything. Dad was never the same. Mom worked herself to the bone. Allison and I. My voice cracked. We learned what it means to disappear. Richard's hands trembled, knuckles white around his glass. There's no excuse for what I did. I let ambition win. I rewrote the story, and your father, he bore the blame alone. I kept my mouth shut, let everyone believe it was all his fault. He pressed a hand to his eyes. I tried to reach out years later. He never answered. Wouldn't see me. I stared at him, not knowing if I felt anger, pity, or just a hollow relief at finally knowing the truth. You didn't just ruin his career, I whispered. You broke our family. You erased us. Richard nodded slowly, looking older than I'd ever seen him. You're right, and nothing I do now can ever undo it. The photograph trembled in my hand. The silence between us was thick, a web of secrets and wasted years. I swallowed hard. Why are you telling me this now? Richard took a shuddering breath. Because I saw how my son treated you tonight. How this family still chooses who gets a seat at the table. I couldn't let the pattern continue. Not another generation. A wave of exhaustion washed over me. For a second, I just wanted to run, to leave this house and its ghosts behind, but something kept me rooted. This wasn't just his confession. It was mine too. The end of my silence, the truth finally dragged into the light. A knock at the door shattered the moment. The knob turned and Bradley stepped in, his face stiff with barely contained annoyance. Dad, people are asking questions, he said, not bothering to hide his impatience. What are you talking about in here? Richard straightened, his features tightening as he looked at his son. This is something you should hear too, Bradley. I saw Allison's shadow in the hallway, her presence just beyond the threshold. I could feel her worry, her fear of what this would mean for all of us. Bradley dropped into a chair, crossing his arms. If this is about some ancient business feud, I really don't see the point. Richard's jaw clenched. It's not a feud, it's a reckoning. Hannah deserves to know what happened. He looked at both of us, his voice softer now, almost pleading. The truth is, everything this family has, the house, the company, our status, was built at the expense of Hannah's father. At the expense of her family. Bradley scoffed, but his bravado faltered. You can't blame yourself for every bad decision. Dad, people move on. Richard shook his head. You don't understand. I made sure Jonathan Matthews could never recover. I lied to our clients. I covered my tracks. I built my legacy by destroying someone who trusted me. He looked down, voice shaking. I've lived with that guilt for decades. Tonight, seeing you dismiss Hannah, watching this family shut her out, I realized I can't keep running from what I did. Silence fell thick and absolute. The truth hung between us, a weight no one could escape. Finally I spoke, voice raw. What are you going to do now? Tell them all. Tell Allison? Richard nodded, resolve settling in his features. Yes. It's time. No more secrets. Not for me, not for this family. For the first time I saw the man beneath the armor, a man shaped by shame and regret, but finally maybe ready to pay the price. As I stood to leave, Bradley stayed behind, eyes narrowed, unwilling or maybe unable to accept what he'd heard. Allison met me in the hallway. She took my hand, squeezing hard. "Are you okay?" she whispered. I nodded, but neither of us believed it. Behind us, the truth finally stirred awake, hungry and waiting for its place at the table. I knew the reckoning wasn't over. It was only just beginning. I stepped out of Richard's study, my head full of ghosts, my hands shaking. The hallway was empty except for Allison, who hovered at the doorway, her face pale and drawn. She looked at me, eyes full of questions she wasn't ready to ask. "Did he tell you?" she whispered. I nodded, and for a moment the air between us felt thick with everything we'd never said. Guilt, fear, even a strange relief. She took a shaky breath, squeezed my hand. "Are you okay?" I wasn't sure how to answer, so I didn't. The murmur of conversation from the drawing room called us back. It sounded too loud, too bright, like a party in someone else's dream. We made our way to the main room, the plush carpet swallowing our footsteps. As we entered, I could feel every eye flick toward us, curiosity sharpened by the earlier disturbance. Bradley slipped in behind, his jaw tight. Richard came last, his stride slower, heavier than before. He took his seat at the head of the table, but this time he looked smaller, older, no longer the unshakable patriarch. Evelyn shot Richard a look, all questions and no answers. "All right, everyone," Richard said, his voice cutting through the air. "Before we continue, I have something I need to say. To all of you." The chatter died instantly. Glasses stilled, silverware frozen midair. Allison's hand found mine under the table, her grip fierce. I felt her pulse in my palm, wild and frantic. I steadied my breath, heart pounding as the world seemed to tilt and slow. This was at the moment the truth would finally find its way out of the dark. Richard took a long look around the table, meeting each gaze in turn. The room had never felt so silent. For once, even Bradley's bravado faded to the background. Richard set both hands flat on the polished table. His voice, when it came, was low but unshakable. "I owe everyone here the truth. For years I kept secrets that cost another family everything." A murmur swept the room, chairs shifting, Evelyn's eyes going wide with alarm. "Richard, is this really necessary?" she whispered, but he didn't look her way. He went on. "Most of you know my career began with a partnership. Jonathan Matthews and I started a firm together long before this house, this company, any of what you see here." He paused, swallowing hard. "But when a deal went wrong, I made decisions out of fear and ambition. I rewrote the narrative. I blamed him for our failure. I let him take the fall. His reputation, his livelihood, his family, all of it was lost, and I let it happen." Gasps and shocked murmurs rose around the table. Allison's grip on my hand tightened until it hurt. Bradley looked as if someone had struck him. Richard's voice faltered for a moment, but he pressed on. "I built everything we have on that lie. I carried it alone for decades. Tonight I saw how we still treat people as outsiders, how patterns repeat. I refuse to keep this secret one day longer." He turned to face me, and for the first time I saw true apology in his eyes. "Hannah, I'm sorry for what I did to your father, to your family, to you." The room seemed to hold its breath. Allison's breath hitched, tears sliding down her face. Evelyn sat frozen, her hand pressed to her mouth. Around the table, the Wilsons, so composed, so confident, looked suddenly lost, as if the foundation beneath their feet had cracked wide open. A truth too long buried had finally broken the surface. And now, there was nowhere left to hide. The silence that followed was heavier than any accusation. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The truth had shattered the room, scattering each person to their own corner of shock. Then Bradley's voice cut through, sharp with anger. "Dad, this is ancient history. Why bring it up now? It doesn't change anything." Richard faced him, eyes steady. "It changes everything, Bradley. Especially the way we treat people. The legacy we pass down." Bradley scoffed, pushing back his chair. "You're just trying to ruin my promotion, aren't you? Throwing all this at me in front of everyone. This isn't about Hannah. It's about you losing your grip." Allison flinched at his words, but Richard shook his head. "This isn't about power or money. It's about decency. About finally telling the truth no matter what it costs me. Evelyn tried to step in, her tone brittle. Richard, please think about the family, about the company. There's no reason to. Richard stopped her with a look. The family survived a lie. It can survive the truth. The cousins and spouses exchanged uneasy glances, old alliances shifting. Elizabeth, always the diplomat, finally spoke. If this is true, then what happens now? Do we apologize and just move on? Her words hung between us all. The answer seemed impossible. I felt every gaze swing my way, some angry, some embarrassed, some searching for guidance I couldn't give. My hands shook, but I lifted my chin. You can't undo the past, but you can choose what you do with it now. Bradley snorted. What, you want some kind of payout? An apology? This is just more drama. I met his eyes, voice steady. I want acknowledgement. I want the pattern to stop. I want to know that my father wasn't erased for nothing. Allison finally spoke, voice trembling but clear. And I want to know that I didn't marry into a family built on someone else's pain. The room rippled, old certainties collapsing, everyone suddenly forced to choose a side. Tonight, justice wasn't quiet. It was loud, painful, and utterly real. The room seemed to contract, everyone shrinking back into themselves, uncertain where to stand. Evelyn looked from Richard to me, her face stricken. I knew there was some bad blood, but… Richard, you never told me the truth. Richard's voice was gentler now, but unflinching. I thought I was protecting you. I see now I was only protecting myself. A cousin murmured, how could you keep something like this hidden all these years? The answer was everywhere, in the walls, the silver, the way everyone had learned to look the other way. Allison wiped at her tears, her voice small but fierce. I spent years trying to fit in here. I gave up so much, myself, my sister, even my own happiness. I thought if I worked hard enough, loved hard enough, I could belong. But you can't build family on secrets and silence. Her words hung in the air, raw and trembling. She turned to Bradley, who stared at her, jaw set. You made me choose between your approval and my own blood. I can't do it anymore. Bradley looked away, unable or unwilling to meet her gaze. The room was filled with shifting loyalties, some glances soft with sympathy, others hard with denial. Elizabeth reached across the table, her hand finding mine. I'm sorry, Hannah, for not seeing, for not asking. A cousin echoed, her voice low. We were taught not to question. Maybe that ends tonight. Richard nodded, voice rough. Let it end tonight. It was the kind of reckoning that strips away every illusion, leaving only what's real: pain, hope, and the possibility of something better. The choice was in front of each of us now: hold on to the past or let it go. I realized as I looked around the table that sometimes justice is simply the courage to face each other and refuse to pretend any longer. No one knew quite how to end it. The usual scripts, another toast, a joke, a clink of glasses, had all been burned away by what had just happened. For a moment we just sat, letting the silence settle heavy as stone. Richard stood, his voice quiet but ringing through the room. I can't undo the harm I've caused, but I can refuse to hide from it any longer. If you want to be angry at me, not at Hannah or her family. The debt is mine alone. Evelyn wiped her eyes, mascara smudged, the perfect mask she'd worn all evening now slipping. She reached for Richard's hand. We can't go back, but we can choose who we are now. Bradley remained rigid, face like stone. You've ruined everything, he muttered, barely loud enough to hear. You should have kept this buried. Allison's voice, clear and certain, answered him. No, Bradley. What ruined us was the lie, not the truth. People rose from the table slowly, some moving to comfort Richard, some to console Evelyn, a few to slip out quietly into the night. There was no grace in the exit, only the rawness of a family reckoning with itself at last. I stood suddenly exhausted. The room felt different now, not grand, but stripped bare, honest. Allison found me in the crowd, wrapping her arms around me. For the first time in years, I felt her hold tight, her heartbeat as frantic as my own. I'm sorry, she whispered. For all of it. I shook my head, the tears finally coming. Me too. As the crowd thinned, Richard came to stand beside us. Whatever you need, Hannah. Whatever I can do, my door is open. I nodded, knowing there was still a long road ahead. But the first stone had been turned. And nothing would ever be quite the same. After everyone left, the house felt cavernous and wrong, echoing with ghosts and the memory of raised voices. I wandered through the empty halls, my footsteps quiet on the marble floors, passing closed doors and forgotten laughter. The party was over, but the mess remained. Glasses abandoned on tables, half-melted candles. Chairs left askew as if the people who'd used them were fleeing a fire. Allison found me in the kitchen, arms wrapped tight around herself, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen. She tried to smile, but it came out crooked. "You still here?" she whispered. I nodded, unable to speak. She poured 2 glasses of water, set one in front of me. Her hand shook, sloshing a little onto the counter. "I don't know what happens now," she said, voice thin as tissue. "I thought telling the truth would make me feel better. I just feel hollow." I traced a drop of water with my finger, thinking of all the years we'd spent pretending things were fine. How many lies we'd swallowed just to keep the peace. Allison slid to the floor, knees drawn up. "It's like the spell broke. I can't go back to how things were. I don't even want to." I sat beside her, the tile cold through my jeans. For a long time we just breathed together, letting the world outside fade away. "I missed you," she said, finally, voice cracking. A tear slid down my cheek. "I missed you too." It was the most honest thing either of us had said in years. Morning crept in, gray and heavy, filtering through the kitchen windows. Allison and I hadn't moved from the floor. At some point I'd found a blanket in a nearby chair and thrown it over our shoulders, but neither of us had slept. We talked in low voices, careful not to wake old ghosts. She told me about the loneliness of perfection, the exhaustion of always performing. I admitted how small I'd felt year after year, watching her disappear behind someone else's life. "I thought I had to become them," she confessed, staring at her hands. "I thought if I just tried harder, if I was perfect enough, I'd finally belong. But all I did was lose myself." I swallowed, the ache in my throat sharp as a bruise. "I blamed you sometimes, for leaving me behind. For letting them treat me like I was nothing. I didn't know how hard you were fighting just to stay afloat." Allison nodded, tears shining in her eyes. "I wish I'd stood up for you, for both of us." The sun caught on the half-empty glasses and the crumbs of cake left on the counter. For the first time, the mess didn't feel shameful, it felt honest. Evidence of something real finally broken open. She pulled out her phone, thumb hovering over a draft text to Bradley. "I'm not sure what to say," she whispered. "Tell him the truth," I said softly. "Not for him. For you." She set the phone down, breathing out. "I'm so tired of pretending." We sat together in the hush of the morning, the old rules and rituals scattered at our feet. Outside, a bird sang a thin, uncertain thread of hope. For the first time, we didn't reach for the broom. We let the ruins stay where they were, at least for now. We needed to see the truth, no matter how much it hurt, before we could even think about building anything new. Later that morning, after a restless shower and a mug of too strong coffee, I found myself in Allison's old bedroom. The walls still wore the faint outline of her teenage posters, mostly covered now by bland art picked by decorators. There was a vanity by the window, cluttered with makeup she no longer used. I caught my own reflection. My eyes were puffy, my hair a mess, last night's mascara smudged. I almost laughed. For years I'd tried to show up at these family gatherings looking untouchable, sharp clothes, practice smile armor in every detail. But today, stripped bare, I looked more like myself than I had in a long time. Allison stepped in, pausing in the doorway. She wore sweatpants and an old college t-shirt, hair pulled into a messy bun, face clean of makeup. She looked tired. She looked real. She flopped onto the bed, hugging a pillow to her chest. "Do you remember," she said, "how we used to talk about running away? After Mom and Dad split up, how we'd get an apartment, just us, somewhere far away." I smiled, a memory flickering. "Yeah. I wanted to move to New York and be a famous photographer. You wanted to run a bakery and only eat cookies for breakfast." She grinned, wiping her eyes. "We really thought we could outrun everything, didn't we?" I shrugged. "Maybe you can't outrun the past. Maybe you just have to face it. Like looking in the mirror seeing what's there, ugly or not. Allison's shoulders sagged. I lost sight of you. Of myself. I let them decide who I was supposed to be. I let Bradley decide. Her voice cracked. I'm scared, Han. I don't know what comes next. I sat beside her, taking her hand. Neither do I. But at least now we're not lying to each other or ourselves. We sat in the soft, uncertain light, not as sisters pulled apart by history, but as two women beginning finally to find their way back. Midday drifted in quietly, sunlight pooling on the carpet and making the dust dance. Allison paced the hallway, phone in hand, as if circling a decision she couldn't quite make. I heard her voice hushed but clear behind the half-closed door. No, Bradley, I'm not coming back. Not right now. I need space. I need to think about what I want. There was a pause, a heavy silence on the other end. I imagined Bradley's protest, his confusion turning to anger, his certainty finally shaken. Allison's voice broke as she continued. I spent years shaping myself for your family, for your approval. I thought if I loved hard enough, worked hard enough, I could fix it. But I can't fix what's broken if no one else is willing to try. She listened for a while, then ended the call, letting her phone slip from her fingers to the bed. She stood in the doorway, the outline of sunlight tracing her shoulders. It's over, isn't it? She asked, her voice raw. I nodded. It might be the end of what you thought your life would look like. But maybe that's not the same as losing everything. We walked outside together, the air cool, and knew the world both smaller and more open. Allison wrapped her arms around herself, but her steps were surer than I'd seen in years. We passed the front garden where roses bloomed in impossible order. I thought of all the ways this family had tried to force things to grow in perfect lines, cutting back, pruning, hiding the wildness. But sometimes you have to let things grow messy if you want anything real to last. We sat on the porch steps, the silence finally easy between us. I'm scared, Allison admitted. So am I answered. We watched a pair of sparrows fight, then fly away together. Not every conversation gets finished. But sometimes just starting one is enough. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, the house seemed to exhale, less like a museum, more like a place where real people lived. The sharp edges softened the silence, less accusing. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like an intruder in my sister's world. Allison brewed tea, and we sat in the dim kitchen, our chairs drawn close. We didn't need to fill the air with promises or apologies. There was comfort in the simple things, the clink of a spoon, the warmth of a mug in our hands, the way grief can settle when it's finally named out loud. She spoke quietly, almost to herself. I used to think if I just kept moving, kept achieving, the emptiness would fade. But it just got louder. I nodded, feeling the same truth in my chest. I know. I tried to disappear, hoping someone would notice. I stopped believing that being seen was possible. We sat together, letting the quiet stretch between us, a new kind of quiet, not heavy or lonely but honest. After a while, Allison smiled. It was small, unsteady but real. Do you think it gets easier? I squeezed her hand. Not quickly. But maybe step by step. Outside, the porch light flickered on, casting a warm circle on the path. For the first time, I could imagine coming back to this house and not feeling out of place. Maybe even belonging in our own imperfect way. We watched the night settle in, not as strangers, not as rivals, but as sisters, finally on the same side of the glass. A week later, I found myself staring out an airplane window, clouds drifting below like islands in a gray sea. Allison sat beside me, quiet, lost in her own thoughts. We hadn't been back to see Dad in years, not together, not since before everything fell apart. We landed in Phoenix, the heat a sudden slap after Chicago's cool spring. The drive out to his little house was mostly silence, broken now and then by memories we couldn't quite voice. I watched the desert roll by, red earth, distant mountains, an old highway lined with creosote and dust. For a moment the world felt stripped down to essentials, sky, land, the two of us, our shadows in the glass. Dad's house was small, tucked into a sunburnt lot on the edge of town. The porch sagged, a wind chime spun lazy circles in the breeze. He met us at the door, older and thinner than I remembered, but his eyes still kind. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Allison reached for him. "Hey, Dad." He pulled us both in his arms, strong but shaking. "My girls, you're here." Inside, the air was cool, the scent of coffee and books lingering. I set my bag down, nerves humming. We sat in the faded living room, surrounded by family photos, none newer than a decade old. The silence was thick, full of things we'd never asked. Finally, Dad spoke, his voice low. "Your call scared me, Hannah. I knew someday the past would catch up. But I didn't know it would be now." Allison squeezed his hand. "We needed to know, Dad. About everything." He nodded, staring into his coffee. "Then let's talk. No more secrets. Not for us." For the first time in years, I felt ready. Whatever truth cost, I wanted to pay it together. We gathered around the little kitchen table, a faded checkered cloth between us. The sun poured through the window, painting gold on Dad's gray hair. He stirred his coffee slowly, the spoon clinking as if buying time. Allison went first. "Dad, we know about Richard Wilson. He told us everything." Dad's hand stilled, knuckles white. He set the spoon aside, eyes locked on the table. "He said he was your friend," I whispered. "Your partner. He said he betrayed you." For a moment, he didn't move. The clock ticked in the background, the old fridge humming. "I never wanted you girls to carry that story," he said, at last, voice rough. "It was too heavy for you. For your mom. For anyone." He sighed. "Richard and I were closer than brothers once. We built everything together. When it started to go bad, I thought we could fix it if we just stuck together." His voice caught. But I was naive. He cut me out. I lost my job, my savings, even friends. People blamed me for everything that went wrong. "Your mother tried to hold on, but shame is contagious." He looked up, tears shining in tired eyes. "I know I failed you. I know I wasn't the father you deserved after that. I was angry and sad, and I couldn't let it go." Allison squeezed his shoulder. "You did your best, Dad. We wanted the truth. Not the fairy tale." I nodded, feeling the ache of all those lost years. We wanted to understand, and to stop carrying someone else's silence. Dad let out a long, shaky breath. "Thank you for coming back. I'm sorry I made you wait so long for this." We sat together in the golden light, the old story at last given words. The wounds weren't healed, but at least now they had a name. The room was quiet except for the creak of Dad's chair and the steady tick of the clock. I looked at Allison, saw my own hesitation mirrored in her face. There was so much left unsaid: anger, grief, love, the longing for a life that never quite happened. Dad rubbed his eyes, clearing his throat. "I know Richard tried to reach me years ago. Letters, phone calls. I never answered. I couldn't." He shook his head. "I wasn't ready to forgive him. Maybe I'm still not." Allison leaned forward, her voice gentle. "He offered to set up a foundation. A scholarship in your name. He wants to make amends." Dad blinked in surprise, sadness and pride mixed in his eyes. "He's trying to pay a debt that can't be paid. But if it helps someone else, maybe that's worth something." I reached for his hand. "We told him we didn't want money for ourselves. We wanted something good to come from what happened. That's what you taught us, Dad. Even when things broke, you found a way to help people." His fingers squeezed mine, rough and warm. "I tried, sweetheart. That's all any of us can do." We sat in that fragile peace, the three of us linked by memory and regret, but also by something softer: hope that the pain hadn't been wasted. "I'm sorry for the times I shut you out," Dad said, voice thick. "I thought protecting you meant hiding the truth. I see now, it only made the shadows deeper." Allison's eyes filled. "No more shadows, Dad. We want you back, all of you, not just the strong parts." I nodded, tears finally rising. "Me too." It wasn't forgiveness all at once. It was forgiveness in pieces, offered, received, and sometimes still out of reach. But in that moment, it felt enough just to try. Later that afternoon, we walked with Dad through his small backyard, the desert sun painting everything gold. The air smelled of sage and distant rain. Cacti lined the fence, and birds flashed between scraggly trees, more wild than beautiful but undeniably alive. We talked about ordinary things: his neighbor's stubborn dog, the new library down the street, what we missed about Wisconsin winters. The heaviness began to lift, not gone but easier to bear with each step and story shared. Dad paused by a faded lawn chair looking out over the scrubby lot. "I used to sit here at night," he said, "wondering what I would say if you girls ever asked me what happened. I rehearsed 100 speeches. None of them seemed right." Allison smiled gently. "You don't have to rehearse anymore. We're here." He chuckled, wiping at his eyes. I guess I needed to let go of being the father who had all the answers. I squeezed his shoulder. "We never needed perfect. We just needed you." We settled on the porch steps, letting the silence stretch. It wasn't awkward this time, just honest. I could feel old anger draining away, leaving only tiredness and a fragile gratitude. Dad turned to us, serious but soft. "Whatever comes next with Richard, with the Wilsons, it's up to you. You don't owe them forgiveness, but you can choose peace if you want. It doesn't have to be anyone's story but your own." Allison nodded. I want to stop living for other people's approval. I want to start over. For me, I felt a spark of that hope too. Not for a clean slate, but for a future that didn't run on old pain. Letting go didn't mean forgetting. It meant carrying only what mattered and putting the rest down at last. As the sun dipped low, we sat together, me, Allison, and Dad on the porch, the sky blazing with colors that seemed impossible anywhere but Arizona. The long shadows of the day stretched out behind us, but for once they felt more like memories than threats. Allison spoke first, voice quiet but sure. "I'm going back to Milwaukee. I want to be close to you. I don't know exactly what comes next, but I want to figure it out for myself this time." Dad nodded, pride flickering in his tired eyes. "You'll do fine, kiddo. Both of you will." I smiled, feeling lighter. "I'm going to start teaching again. Workshops, maybe even a new show. I want to use what I've learned not to prove anything but because it matters to me now." We talked about little things, favorite books, childhood road trips, the neighbor's lemon tree that always dropped fruit on Dad's side of the fence. It was ordinary, and it was everything. The phone buzzed with a new message, Richard sending word that the first scholarships would be announced in Dad's name, the funds set aside for students who'd lost everything but still kept going. Dad looked at me, emotion shining in his eyes. Maybe something good can come from it after all. The evening settled, peaceful and alive. For the first time in a long while, the silence was gentle. I knew the road ahead would not be easy. There would be reminders, regrets, hard days to come. But tonight we had chosen each other. We had chosen honesty and the slow hard work of moving forward. No more pretending. No more hiding. Just three people, family imperfect but real, making a new story one step at a time. We drove north out of Arizona at dawn, the desert, giving way to farmland, and then slowly to the city skyline of Milwaukee, our home, or what was left of it. The air was cooler here, the light softer. I could almost pretend the last few weeks hadn't changed everything, but each mile reminded me that nothing would ever be quite the same. Allison and I moved into a small apartment above an old bakery on the east side. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. We spent the first night unpacking boxes and eating pie with our fingers, the laughter real and messy. For the first time in years, there was no performance, no need to shrink or polish our edges. Days settled into a new kind of rhythm. Allison found a job at the local community center, helping teens figure out futures no one had mapped for them. She enrolled in evening classes, social work, psychology, anything that pointed toward building a life with purpose. Sometimes she'd come home late, exhausted, but glowing in a way I hadn't seen since we were kids. She was becoming herself again, piece by piece, unlearning the need to belong to anyone but herself. I reopened my photography studio in a corner of Walker's Point, teaching workshops on weekends, offering free classes for girls with old cameras and big dreams. My work shifted to no more chasing galleries or chasing approval. Instead, I started a project called Our Real Name, portraits of women and families remaking themselves after loss. Their stories layered over mine, healing me in ways I hadn't expected. We rebuilt our circles slow and careful. Old friends drifted back in. Dad called every Sunday. Even Mom visited, her voice softer, her laughter less brittle. We ate together when we could: pizza, coffee, grocery store cake. No one pretended things had never gone wrong. We simply built forward from the truth. Bradley tried to call a few times, but Allison let them go to voicemail. She wrote a letter she never sent, letting her heart empty out onto the page. "I forgive you," she wrote, "but I'm choosing my own life now." She folded the paper and tucked it in her drawer, her own private closure. News came that Richard Wilson had announced his retirement. The Jonathan Matthews Foundation was real, and the first scholarship recipients sent thank you notes, kids with hope and nowhere to go but up. Richard wrote to Dad, "I wish I'd told the truth sooner. Thank you for letting me try to make it right." Dad wrote back, brief but kind. "We all make mistakes, Richard. Let's do better for their sake." Life was quieter but deeper. The wounds were there, but they were scars now, not open cuts. Allison and I began to dream again. We talked about a road trip to the coast, a backyard garden, a gallery showing that was more potluck than black tie. Sometimes we just sat together on the fire escape, feet dangling over the alley, watching the city breathe. We weren't perfect sisters. We argued about chores and bills and who finished the milk. But when the sun rose each morning, it found us there, alive, stubborn, still holding on to each other. One evening, as I hung a new photo on the studio wall, Allison stepped in behind me. She looked at the image, a mother and daughter, hands linked, laughing in the golden light. "They look happy," she said. I nodded. "They are. It's real." She smiled, tucking her hair behind her ear. "So are we." I pressed the last nail in, stepping back to admire the crooked line of frames. The stories didn't match, but they belonged. Like us, imperfect, unfinished, but real. And as night fell over Milwaukee, I realized that for the first time our family name was something I was proud to carry. Not because it was flawless, but because it was honest. We had built new roots, and this time they were our own. Spring came slow and green to Milwaukee, softening the city's rough edges. Allison and I found ourselves growing into this new life, awkwardly at first, then with more grace. Days passed, not with the old sense of waiting for a shoe to drop, but with a quiet trust that whatever came next, we could handle it. Our apartment became a gathering place. Friends dropped by with flowers, with news, with laughter that filled up the kitchen. Dad visited every other weekend, bringing books and recipes from Arizona, joking that he'd finally found a use for his empty nest. Even Mom relaxed into the new rhythm, joining us for lazy Sunday breakfasts and walks by the lake. Allison's world kept opening. Her classes led to a spot in a graduate program. She worked late, came home tired but glowing. The center asked her to lead a workshop on family healing. She hesitated at first, but I watched her stand in front of a circle of girls, honest and nervous, sharing her story. Afterward, she told me, "I used to think telling the truth would break me. But it's the only way I know I'm real." My studio flourished. Our real name grew one photograph at a time. Women came in with their children, or alone, or with friends who held their hands. Some told their stories in a rush, some let the camera do the talking. Each portrait was a promise that wounds could become something beautiful, that identity wasn't what others named you, it was what you reclaimed. One afternoon, Allison and I hosted a small show in the studio. The air buzzed with voices, with hope, with the kind of possibility I'd almost forgotten. Dad stood by the window, smiling quietly, a plate of cookies in hand. Richard Wilson's letter of apology, framed and tucked beside a photograph of him and Dad from decades past, was displayed not as a wound but as a piece of the puzzle. When the crowd thinned, Allison pulled me onto the fire escape. The city hummed below, gold in the last light. "Do you ever wonder if we're finally enough?" she asked. I thought about it, the years of shrinking, of not belonging, of trying to fit someone else's shape. I let the cool air fill my lungs. I think we were always enough. We just needed to stop asking for permission. We sat together, legs swinging over the alley, the past settled but not erased. It was part of us, a shadow, sometimes a lesson, always. We chose each other every day in all our mess and glory. As the stars blinked out above Milwaukee, I whispered, We belong here. Just like this. Allison rested her head on my shoulder, quiet and sure. Yeah, just like this. And for the first time, belonging didn't feel like a prize to be won. It felt like the home we had built together at last. Looking back, I realized the power was never in their acceptance. It was in my own voice, my own truth. I don't need anyone else's permission to belong, to heal, or to start over. We built a new family out of honesty, scars, and forgiveness, messy, imperfect, but real. In the end, taking back your name is the bravest thing you can do. If you uncovered the truth about your family, would you confront it or keep the peace? Tell me in the comments. I'm listening, and I'm not alone anymore.